Welcome to the warrant article discussion co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters and the Town Meeting Members Association. First discussion will be a proposal for a local historic district for properties associated with architect Henry Hobson Richardson and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. Then we will hear about a proposed long-term planning and zoning bylaw review. For the record, combined reports and supplements with explanations for all upcoming warrant articles are available on the town's website. The reports have analysis and recommendations in favor or opposition from the Select Board, Advisory Committee, and other town committees. So, moving forward, we will be hearing first about Article 20. It's a bylaw amendment that would establish what's called a thematic local historic district. It would include the historic properties associated with influential 19th century architect Henry Hobson Richardson and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. Of the 5 properties, Fairstead, the home and office of Frederick Law Olmsted, is a National Historic Site under the National Park Service. The proposal is intended to recognize the contributions of Richardson and Olmsted to state, local, and national architectural and landscape design. We will hear from architectural historian Dennis DeWitt, a member of the Massachusetts Historical Commission, and full disclosure, my husband for 50+ years. So Dennis, you have the floor, and with luck, you share your slides.
Last, I think it was January, the Preservation Commission had a hearing on the proposed demolition of these 2 houses, which are in the Green Hill area of town, one on Warren Street and one next to it, but with an address currently on Cottage Street, although historically it was also accessed from Warren Street. The Perkins Hooper Richardson house was built in this form in 1805 by Samuel Gardner Perkins, who was a merchant, brother of the much more famous and wealthier Thomas H. Perkins, and partner at one point, but not at the time he built this house. The house next to it, Cliffside, was the second Brookline home of John Charles Olmsted, who was the nephew and adopted son of Frederick Law Olmsted and his partner and successor. It reflects a number of changes that were made in 1917 when John Charles' wife inherited this house from her parents. There was a third house on the property, which was built in the on the 3 properties that came up for demolition. It was built in the 1970s. The Preservation Commission put a demolition delay on these 2, and the process began of considering whether they should be in a local historic district. Brookline presently has 8 local historic districts, of which 7 are neighborhood areas and 1 is an individual property. It soon became apparent that there was a logic to making a thematic district which would be discontinuous and just include several properties. There are 3 personalities related to this. Henry Hobson Richardson on the upper left, portrait that's now in the National Portrait Gallery. Frederick Law Olmsted on the right, and John Charles Olmsted lower left. And Richardson first came to Boston, Boston area in 1873 when he won the competition for Trinity Church. Olmsted followed him in the 1880s. They had a long, close working relationship on a number of projects, and so it made sense for them to be just down the road. And they both operated with an unusual arrangement, which Richardson pioneered, of having his studios attached to his house. And Olmsted, of course, anybody who's been to Fairstead knows that that's the way Fairstead was set up as well. The two other properties that are included in this district, two other full properties, are the first John Charles Olmsted house, which is at 16 Warren Street, and Fairstead itself, which is noted as a national park site and open to the public as a museum. And then the fifth property, next slide, is the fairly monumentally scaled, although it's not evident in this picture, and very elegant grave marker of Frederick Law, of Henry Hobson Richardson and his wife Julia in Brookline's Walnut Hill Cemetery. It's a very lovely place. So those are the five sites. Next slide. And you can see how they relate to each other. At the top, opposite the reservoir, is 16 Warren. Between, then the next one down is 99 Warren, which is Fairstead. And then at the bottom, the two sites together are 222 Warren and 25 Cottage, the Olmsted and Richardson houses. And then on the left, the location of Richardson's grave in the cemetery. Next. There's been a lot of misinformation about the design of the Richardson house. It has been since the 1950s referred to as a Jamaica planter's house. It has nothing to do with Jamaica or planters, but Perkins with his brothers in the late 1880s and early 1890s had a trading company in Haiti, and clearly there was some involvement in the slave trade, although primarily their business involved importing New England goods to Haiti, things like lumber and fish. But there's no question that, as with, frankly, a lot of things from New England, supported the Caribbean slave plantation economy. However, the form of this house, which is very unusual and is one of three surviving in Brookline, the third one is Mrs. Jack Gardner's house, just between Fairstead and this location. These houses derive eventually from Mount Vernon. The house across the way from the original driveway entrance to the Perkins Hooper Richardson house, 25 Cottage, is Old Green Hill, 1795, built about 10 years earlier by Senator George Cabot, and was intended, next slide, if I've got these in order, and maybe I don't. So, but anyway, it was intended as a, it was intended basically as a Federalist political statement of alliance with George Washington. We can get back to that in a bit. Inside the Richardson house is one major space, not huge, but one majorly important space designed by him. Richardson was unwell for much of his time, increasingly so. He died in this house at the age of 47 in 1886. And this is the studio bedroom from which he worked. Richardson, as you saw in the portrait, was a massive man. He had Bright's disease, which he eventually died of. On the right is a sort of inglenook with two facing benches flanked by paneled closets and a pair of windows. And those windows allowed him to see, in those days when there were fewer trees, the tower of Trinity Church going up in the back bay. And the walls, as you can see, are covered with cork, and they have a ledge along the edge, at the bottom edge of the cork, and drawings could be pinned up there for him to see. The ceiling, of course, is done in this sort of Moorish pattern, and it was originally, as I recall, descriptions, natural wood with gilding. So it's a very interesting space. There's no hint of it on the outside. Next. Of course, Olmsted in Brookline is known for Beacon Street and our Olmsted Park and the Riverway, and of course those are constituents of the Emerald Necklace, which is one of Olmsted's most famous creations, probably second only to Central Park in New York. When Olmsted passed from the scene in the 1890s, his son, John Charles, continued to operate the firm. And in fact, the Olmsteds were involved in the Brookline's first zoning. And Olmsted's son was was the first chair of the planning board in Brookline, 1916, as I recall. Next. Because I put these things together rather quickly. They're not entirely in the order that they should have been, but anyway, here is the two porticoed houses in Brookline, and then of course Mount Vernon's portico, which was the inspiration for this. There are copies of Mount Vernon, of course, became widespread in the 20th century, but I'm unaware of, and other scholars I've discussed this with are unaware of any copies prior to the 1860s, right after the Civil War. So, but there's reasonable evidence that this is the most logical explanation for this very stark, plain two-story colonnade that these houses acquired. Next. And of course, the reason that it was important for both Olmsted and Richardson to be recognized in this thematic district was that they worked together collaboratively on a number of projects, including the New York State Capitol and a very large a mental institution in Buffalo, and these two examples closer to home, the Northeastern Town Hall and Library, and the Stonehurst House, Robert Treat Payne estate in Waltham. Next. Discussion in the Town Meeting Members Association leading toward the further discussion and vote next week on this has to do with a desire, perfectly reasonable, for there to be some sort of a tablet, historic tablet at the site of the Richardson House, discussing the history of the house and slavery. When the developer who came to the Preservation Commission for the first design review under the demolition delay law, and if of course the district is passed, the design review process will transfer to being under the local district bylaw. They proposed a tablet by the roadside discussing the history of the Richardson House. Frankly, in terms of Richardson, and the commission members said that it also needed to address the issue of slavery. There were no slaves involved in this house, but in the before the Haitian Revolution, in the early 1890s, the Perkins brothers had been there, and they'd had a warehouse, as I'd noted. The warehouse was burned in the revolution in 1893. Shortly thereafter, Samuel Perkins left his two brothers' firm and joined with his father-in-law, basically trading in Europe. And so that was what he'd been doing for the 10 years before he built this house. So there is that connection rooted in Samuel Perkins' wealth. There is also the fact that Richardson grew up on a sugar plantation, not on a sugar plantation, but in New Orleans, in a family that had a sugar plantation. And that certainly financed his education when he went to Harvard. He then went to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts just at the time the Civil War broke out. The family's plantation, of course, was lost, and he gained no support from it after that. But there is that history to be recognized. And then the third person who's mentioned in relation to this house, Edward Hooper, a classmate of Richardson's, who leased the house to Richardson because Richardson never owned it. Hooper was involved during the Civil War in aiding and assisting the freedmen, and then subsequently in the Freedmen's Association. So all of that needs to be recognized. That's going to be part of the discussion at town meeting a week from Tuesday. And that's basically, I think, the story of this. I guess I will just note that in town meeting, it will need a 2/3 vote.
I'm Paul Warren, a Precinct 1 town meeting member. I'm also a member of the advisory committee and the land use subcommittee that held public hearings on this important article. And I wanted to provide a little bit more kind of context, I think, about how the advisory committee was thinking about this. And it is recommending positive action on this article to town meeting. The advisory committee had really looked at the extension of the Lawrence Historic District, which ended up failing by one vote back at the annual town meeting last year. We really wanted to understand what were the factors that resulted in that, very, very close vote, and were there any similar type of circumstances that may exist with this particular proposal for the historic district. And three really things came out as a result of that. The first, the Lawrence Historic District, the extension was triggered similar to this proposal by a demolition request of two historic significant properties on Kent Street, the corner of Kent Street and Colchester. And the discussion at town meeting at that time and the debate centered around the proximity of those properties to the Beacon Street corridor and public transportation. And as you know, there is a desire by many in town to increase access to housing, walkable housing, to public transportation. So that was one of the factors that went in, that instead of preserving the land and the structures on it, there was a desire to, potentially allow for those properties to be developed into higher density housing, which there's no guarantee actually that that'll happen. But that was one of the arguments that took place. The other situation that existed was, and it does relate to what Dennis brought up about the slave connection here. There was two properties on the north side of Kent Street that were included in the extension of the Lawrence Historic District that were related to redlining of the 30s, which was kind of a government sanctioned banking investment solution that did block out people of color from certain areas of investment. And that's the unfortunate similarities between these two historic districts. The differences are that the Olmsted Richardson thematic historic district, the properties currently are not walkable to public transportation. They could be in the future if someone extends potentially a public transportation line, but they're not. today. And the other issue is the zoning for these properties that are proposed in this historic district are zoned S40, single 40,000 square foot lots. And, you know, without a zoning change, it's highly unlikely those properties wouldn't be able to be developed into higher density housing. And these properties will be lost if the historic district is not put in place and approved by town meeting, because there is a demolition request by the developers to take these properties down. So anyway, I wanted to share that. There was also, I personally put in a request to the moderator to amend the warrant article to address the issue that Dennis has brought up, which is to include education and materials relating to the connection of slavery, the history of slavery, connection to this house, the particular 25 Cottage Street. Unfortunately, that was deemed out of scope because it was an expansion of the article. It's a technical thing with respect to warrant articles. But you know, the advisory committee feels it's critical that these two important histories be told. The relationship that, you know, frankly, funding of this house did come potentially from the slave trade, but also its connection to an important part of you know, our history with Richardson, which is paramount to what Brookline has done, both respect to local planning and city planning from the past. So, Dennis, I want to thank you for stepping in my time slot, and as usual, you've done a great job with the presentation.
And maybe let me just respond to a couple of the points you've made or elaborate on them. The particular location of the extension of the Lawrence district on Kent Street actually was sort of, there was a triple hit there, all related to Longwood. It was next to the Longwood Towers, which people could point to. It was basically next to the Longwood T-stop, so you didn't even have to walk to Beacon Street, and it was across the riverway from the Longwood medical area, which is obviously an enormously dense employment thing. So when you looked at that, as opposed arguably to any other local district that we've had in Brookline, that made it rather different. In respect to this particular land, indeed, there is the 40,000 foot zoning. But in addition, the whole back of that site, something approaching 50% of that site, is a very steep bank going down to an open stream. A, just by its topography, not easily developed, and B, it's subject to wetland restrictions. And technically, you could do an approval not required for lot development there, but reality in terms of the wetlands, et cetera, basically 3 lots is what there is. And this is a developer who has a track record in Brookline of finding lots and redeveloping them as, not to put too fine a point on it, mansions. And that's what he would certainly do by preference. I would note that if there's no LHD, it's hard to imagine that there would be an historic tablet. It's hard to imagine putting an historic tablet in front of a McMansion and making much sense of that. That said, it has been stated by at least one town meeting member, and probably 2, these are credible people, that if there isn't a tablet created as has been proposed by the developer here and certainly concurred with by the commission, he will propose a warrant article for the spring town meeting, which I'm sure would pass, to have the town erect such a thing on the site. Lastly, I guess I would just note that there's certainly slaves in the past of Perkins. It appears that he really didn't come out of the revolution in Haiti with much in the way of money, and that he joined his father-in-law's firm, and that is what paid for this house, which is not huge. If you go inside the house, it's not an enormous house. When Perkins retired here, which is basically what he did after 1805, he grew pears. He was very much involved in the idea of improving horticulture. And it was said that in his old age, he could recognize 27 varieties of pears by their feel, even as his eyes were failing. So that relates to a whole nother history of Brookline, which has to do with growing orchard crops. But that's getting a little far afield, perhaps.
Oh, Dennis, one of the things that we had mentioned in our report, I think the advisory committee's report on this for the combined reports, is that Samuel Perkins' brother, so there was two brothers, right, that were there was three brothers invested in this trade business, with, of course, you know, everybody's acknowledging its role in the sordid past of slavery. You know, one of his brothers coming out of that business when he departed used his funds and his leadership abilities to go, he founded the Perkins School for the Blind, as well as Massachusetts General Hospital. So, you know, it's, you know, it's intertwined, these very difficult histories of the past with other aspects of our history that are important, that need to be told. They both need to be told.
There were three brothers.
Dennis, we need to move. We need to give some other people question chance. Okay.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And Joanna Cobran, if you still have your question, I think you had your hand up. No, no, you're muted. Okay. And then the other question came from Alex Samani. Alec, if you're unmuted, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you. Alok Samani, I'm a town meeting member, Precinct 5, as well as with Paul on the advisory committee. I just a couple quick questions. One, I kind of live in that area, and I know that behind that house, the Richardson house, there's another home that looks to be architecturally significant. And I'm sorry I missed the first part of the conversation. I'm curious whether that house would also be preserved.
Well, it depends, I guess, on how one defines the behind. Really behind the Richardson house on the other side of the stream is the monastery, and the former Schlesinger mansion. I don't know if that's what you're referring to. It's in a large piece of land. Closer to the house and sort of behind to the left is a 1970s deck house. Perhaps that's what you're referring to.
That is the one I'm referring to, correct?
Yeah. That was the third property which the developer acquired, and for which he applied for demolition. And that property, the land, actually was part of the Richardson site, and that was a difficult question which the commission had to deal with, and it decided that given the fact that it was creating this thematic non-contiguous historic district, which was clearly focused on the Richardson Olmsted interaction and theme, if you will, that it felt like too much of a stretch to include that 1970s deck house, which is a lovely house and beautifully sited, but hardly unique, in this context, even though it would have been very nice to have included the land, which until about 1970 was part of the Richardson site.
Okay, so then that would, if this were to pass, then that would be carved out, and the developer could do what the developer chooses to do with that.
It's effectively, although there's demolition delay in place on it now, that will time out in June, and it is not included in the proposed LHD.
Okay, thank you.
All right, folks, if we don't have any more questions about Article 20, we will be ready to move on to 26, which is related indirectly somehow, because it's a resolution recommending a broad-based community review of the town's planning and zoning bylaw with the notion of revising the bylaw over this process. During the review process, petitioners have agreed to modify the original language. And since we have a spokesperson here, Paul Warren, one of the petitioners, he will explain to us the current status of the proposal. And I understand that our new planning director has also been involved in this discussion. So Mr. Warren, you may have the floor, and if you wish to share slides, now would be the time to do it.
Okay. Thank you, Betsy, as usual, and I appreciate your service to our community and these important forums to educate both town meeting members and voters to what all that's happening in town meeting, which is pretty difficult to follow sometimes. Even when you're a sponsor of a warrant article, it's hard to keep track of all that's going on. So before I share my screen, indeed, my name is Paul Warren. I'm a town meeting member in Precinct 1. I live just right in near St. Mary's, down on Lower Beacon Street. As mentioned, I'm also a member of the advisory committee and the land use subcommittee. So all of this stuff is near and dear to my heart. The land use subcommittee deals with zoning proposals and things of that nature. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. How's that? Can you see that okay?
Looks good.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. I did a reboot on my router and I was worried about my bandwidth, but apparently it's okay. So, so briefly, I'm going to try to go through these relatively quick. This is indeed a resolution for town meeting, and the difference between a resolution and a bylaw, a resolution is non-binding. It's not actually a law. And essentially, the town could choose to do it or not. But generally, with town meeting resolutions are in fact considered, a pretty compelling ask of the legislative branch of the executive branch. And so typically they are taken seriously. I have a number of co-petitioners. Linda Pelkey, a longtime friend of mine and passionate planner, is my co-petitioner, as well as a few other folks. So why is warrant article 26 being brought forward? Some time ago, I'm going to say maybe 8 months ago, a couple of us related to land use and concerned about land use formed an organization called Brookline by Design. It includes, I think there's 6 of us. We call it a steering committee. It includes Neil Wyshynski, Linda Pelkey, Gina Hahn. I think Jane Gilman was one of our founding members, as well as some other folks. And really, it was put together and organized because we were concerned about the direction that the town was going in, not necessarily the direction, but generally the lack of an overall vision for the future of Brookline. And there's a lot of advocacy groups in town. Some folks want more housing. Some folks want, better resiliency around climate. Others may want Brookline to be more walkable and livable. There's a lot of groups. People want more economic development. But the challenge that we saw and that we are continuing to see is that there are many plans, but no really singular vision. The last time that Brookline developed a vision for our community was I think it was the 2005 comprehensive plan. That's over 16 years ago. Long before COVID became an issue, long before the screaming climate emergency developed, long before we started to understand the intersection of our public and private spaces and how we could better use them, and the important role that accessibility to green space in transportation plays in a healthy, vibrant community. So, there's a number of plans that seem to be in the works, and I'll talk about those in a moment. But really, the genesis of this proposal is to develop an updated vision, long-term vision for Brookline, importantly with extensive community input. Advocacy groups, of which I'm a part of an advocacy group, and we're very good at advocating for our position. Sometimes when you're busy advocating your position, you block out the voices of other people that may not know how to organize, may not know how to participate and be heard. So that's what this really is about. It's about updating our future plans, but also resulting in zoning changes, which hopefully that will happen. I'll talk about that. So as part of our organizing Brookline by Design, very early on, we sent out an email to gauge what the community thought about this. Do we actually need a plan? Is it important? Would people sign on to this? And so we sent an email. We didn't call people. It was a townwide email. And I think within a week or so, we had about 500 signatures on a letter that would go to the select board, asking if the select board would initiate this comprehensive planning process with individual community members and neighborhood input. And I think right now we're over 600 signatures on that. We haven't really been promoting it. And Neil Wyshynski presented this letter to the select board over the summer. I think it might have been in July or early August. And as the warrant was getting ready to close, we didn't really see a lot of action being taken place by the select board. They have a lot going on. They're very busy doing all that they do. So we felt compelled to put forward a warrant article that would call for planning. So what does Article 26 ask for? But let me say one thing about this, because Betsy alluded to the fact that this thing has been changed. It used to ask for a very detailed study over a 3-year process. And we had submitted a request for some funding for that. After going through the process of public hearings and getting public input from various boards and commissions and individuals, we ended up adjusting the article. And the article now is asking for the select board to appoint a planning process study committee. What the heck is a planning process study committee? Essentially, the Article 26 is now calling for a plan to plan. So this is a group of stakeholders that understand planning for Brookline with the input from the new planning director, Kara Bruton, and their charge will be to get input from the community, a number of stakeholders, and there's a lot of stakeholders that are concerned about Brookline's future land use. Consider the 2005 comprehensive plan and what may be in there that's usable and why it wasn't more effective than it was. And then develop a work program, budget and scope for an inclusive planning process and zoning reform process. So that last statement is important. So this is essentially a group that's going to put together a proposal to develop an updated comprehensive plan and new zoning reform. So it's a plan for a plan. Why now? As I mentioned earlier, there are many pressing concerns that we're facing that just weren't contemplated 16 years ago, or even 4 years ago. The role that equity is playing in housing and access to education, issues around climate and sustainability. There's a lot of proposals that keep coming before town meeting to help us with the climate emergency, housing affordability, as well as not enough capital A affordable housing, which would be subsidized housing, et cetera. There's a lot of issues that are in front of us. And I think we're all struggling to get our arms around them. And so Article 26, as I mentioned, proposes a plan for a plan. It's a framework for a comprehensive townwide planning effort. There's no outcome in mind other than we need to have updated zoning. Our zoning code is, you need a PhD in Rubik's Cube and how to figure out how to interpret our zoning. Even developers have a tremendous problem with trying to understand what they can do or what they can't do. We do anticipate that the resulting plan would be transparent and have broad-based support in a governance committee. So everything done by this committee, the work that they do, the deliberations they have about the future, need to be subject to the open meeting law, because the 60,000 residents of Brookline need to have complete confidence that what is coming forward is transparent and workable, and something that the entire town can get behind. We do have a number of things that are already going on. So it will leverage investments in existing planning projects, which I'll speak about in a moment. And most importantly, this is important, updating our comprehensive plan without then translating that into zoning reform is really would be a waste of time. So we absolutely need to have an updated zoning, a series of proposals. Doesn't have to be all done at once, but we do need to update our zoning. I'm going to skip this slide. So why now? Why do we need to face this now? There's been a number of proposals coming forward from town meeting. Some of them are citizen petitions. Some of them are coming from our planning department, but frankly not enough, because they're so overworked and understaffed that the zoning proposals are coming fast and furious. We're having proposals for reducing parking minimums. We're having proposals to change what type of housing and housing mixes can be done. There'll be proposals coming forward around development of commercial mixed uses in our commercial corridors. So there's a lot coming at us. Many of these things are one-off. So when you get a change in parking minimums, that impacts something else, and we're really not looking at these things holistically. And we need to look at these things holistically. And frankly, this, I think Betsy said that this relates to the prior article that was just discussed by Dennis. The reason that how this relates is we are currently completely reactive around preservation. We need to wait for someone to come with a proposal, typically the owners of properties that want to be included in LHD. We need to find a way to get ahead of this, because it is purely reactive. Ideally, through this comprehensive process, we would identify parcels and properties that we want to preserve, or perhaps modernize, or perhaps we completely redevelop. And as part of that process, we may end up with a better handle on how to do that type of preservation that makes sense. So we're not always kind of chasing it as a reactive process. Many other communities are doing this right now. Somerville has been going through a comprehensive process. I consider them to be, many of us consider them to be a leader, but Medford and Somerville and Newton and Boston are also going through major updates to their comprehensive plans and zoning reform. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on this region to increase housing availability, and housing affordability. So it affects everything. As I mentioned earlier, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide, but it is critical that we update and modernize our zoning bylaw. I would, for anybody who's interested, I'd encourage you to Google Brookline's zoning bylaw and then go read it and see if you can figure out what you can and can't do in Brookline. One of the challenges that our zoning bylaw faces is that it was done in the 60s. So the community values of the 60s were much different than what they are today. So it really is critical that we update our zoning bylaw to really figure out how to provide a balance between the design of our public spaces, our private spaces, and how all these things interrelate. That wasn't really a priority back in the 60s. Frankly, it was more car oriented back in the 60s. And as a result, you can see that from where we are today. So with that, we are asking town meeting to vote in favor of Warrant Article 26, a resolution. It will help us achieve equity, address our climate emergency, enhance our business vitality, which is critical to increase our commercial tax revenue to the town, because we are too dependent on real estate taxes, and to grow our tax base. And more importantly, to develop and maintain the community that's so very special for why many of us came here. in those values, but recognizing that the values are changing, but we still need to maintain the very special, unique thing that we do have going on in Brookline, and that many do want to embrace. So with that, I'm going to conclude my remarks by saying that the Select Board has unanimously supported this. The Planning Board has unanimously supported it. I think the Economic Development Board has unanimously supported it, as well as many other boards and commissions. So we're hoping that this will get broad support at town meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Are there any questions from anybody? Don't see any hands raised at the moment. What I can say, and this is just a general comment, that this task that's being proposed is complex and significant, having personally been involved in that last planning process, and having also, in my experience, I also have been a developer of affordable housing, and I know personally that none of these things have simple solutions. They're all usually more complicated than you could ever imagine. And one of my favorite stories is once we closed on an affordable housing project that was to renovate and to repurpose an existing property in Brookline. And it seemed to me that the closing documents, you needed a shopping cart to haul them all away because of the variety of funding sources that we needed to call on in order to make it possible. And that's just a modest example of how it may sometimes be more complicated than we can imagine to fulfill our particular goals. So I actually don't think it's a bad idea for it to slow down a little bit, Paul, and try to be as thoughtful and inclusive as possible, because it may very well be a process that creates the plan in existence for the next 50 years, who knows? Anyway, having said that, are there any questions about either of these warrant articles? Donna, are you raising your hand? Yes, Donna, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, yes, I just want to thank Dennis for your fascinating historical narrative. You are an exemplary pinch hitter, Dennis. Okay, now for this next presentation. So to dovetail your remark, Betsy, how can a list such as this, which has such critical challenges, be prioritized? I mean, the complexity of the project is really quite overwhelming, but the list is, has several items on it. So how can that be prioritized so that something can actually get accomplished?
Right. So thank you, Donna, for your question. And it's a question that has been asked by many. The thing about strategic planning, and essentially that's what this is, right? It's a community-based plan for the future. It's direction setting, and there are already a number of activities that are underway. For example, there's the housing production plan, which is currently, it just got started. But the goal of the housing production plan is to identify, possible locations for additional housing, both affordable and subsidized housing. We have corridor studies going on. The Route 9 corridor study is underway. It's nearing completion. We have studies going on for multifamily studies. We have a parking study that's being done by the planning department. EDAB just came out with a proposal for a study and an approach to developing lab space within Brookline. There is a lot going on, and we can't just stop the work that's being done, and you can't freeze Brookline as we go through a process for 3 or 4 years to figure out what should be done in the future. So it's going to be critical that as we go through this process, that as the community has its input into the types of values and priorities that it has, that would influence the work that's being done now. And the work that's being done now will also influence the longer term vision and zoning reforms that need to happen. So these two things actually need to happen at once. What would be the priorities coming out of the committee that will be formed in the future? I can't tell you. But what I can say is, you know, everything that we're doing now is a 100-year change. The two homes that unfortunately on Kent Street from the extension of Lawrence Historic District, those will be demolished in the next year. They will be lost forever. And, you know, other green space and our tree canopy, et cetera, you know, these are 100-year changes. So we need to figure out how to have a longer term vision so we can change and stay within the type of vision that we have for a community.
Thank you.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Well,
Yes, thank you.
I think the short answer is all of these ongoing studies need to be integrated and become part of the whole decision-making process going forward. I notice a hand from Mr. DeWitt. Would you like to speak?
Yeah, Paul, a couple of thoughts. You mentioned the question of identifying possible areas or properties to be preserved in the future. And I would note that an issue that has existed in Brookline has been that there's been no time nor funds to identify properties that belong in the National Register, which is a way of first winnowing such things. Really, very little of that has been done since the 1980s. The Preservation Commission is frankly overwhelmed with administering the districts it's got. And the CPA now offers a possibility of hiring consultants to do the job of really creating some districts and identifying more National Register properties. There's some obvious examples of places that were missed in the 80s that really should have been addressed. So that's one point that I would note, because there's a difference between a demolition delay of 12 months and one of 18 months in terms of creating LHDs if they are wanted. And I suspect fewer will be wanted now than had been in the past. Second, I would suggest that there be consideration with respect to the planning board of a design review board that's separate from the planning board, simply because they too have an enormous workload. And Brookline, as you may know, had a neighborhood conservation district bylaw, which was struck down because of case law that had to do with strange things like sign regulations that had nothing really to do with design review. But it is possible to have neighborhood conservation districts under 40A. So that may be something worth considering in conjunction with having such a separate design review board. I guess my last thought would be with respect to the question of the last design review process. It was a strange one in my experience. I sat in on it. It had some really interesting bottom-up planning processes that happened in a couple of neighborhoods, and then that stopped. And there was a long period of in the committee of sort of discussing process without anything happening, and then suddenly the consultants came up with the plan. And I've always felt that the plan that we've got, which is to some extent been honored by not being observed, it was a reflection of that. So I would just have you bear that in mind in terms of how the process goes forward.
Well, Dennis, as you know, and I will show the image on my background. This is actually an 1885 drawing of my home in Brooklyn.
I know that house well, yes.
And Amy, my wife Amy, and I painfully and painstakingly are restoring it based on this image. But, you know, I can assure you that if it was not for an LHD and preservation, this home would be lost. It would have been lost. I'm 30 feet or 40 feet from Beacon Street. you know, you can't see it, but there's, you know, there's a 4-story condominium building that's brick. I could pass Grey Poupon through my bedroom window to my neighbors, you know, and it certainly would have been torn down and developed because the land is frankly so valuable given its proximity to Beacon Street. But, you know, this home does not exist anywhere else in the country. There are features on this home.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is stuck, that there's some techniques in stucco, and I don't need to go on about this, that it's not about who lived in it. It's actually the architecture. And I think other homes that where famous people lived or critical individuals like Richardson and Olmsted certainly need to be preserved. But we, you know, once you tear something down, it's gone. And so that's why, Dennis, you know, maybe we should spend some more time together to talk about this. I'd be very interested in it. We do need to find a way to do both things. We need to find a way to grow Brookline, to have it change and meet the changing values of future generations, while also not losing an important part of our past. And, you know, many of the things that are unique about Brookline is its history. Not only with respect to how Brookline was designed influenced by individuals like Olmsted, but also the very, very unique architecture that helped influence, you know, buildings and development around the country and the world. So it is a passion of mine as it is yours.
And I think on that note, maybe we'll end unless there's another question. But I do have just one final observation based on personal experience again. We live in a house from the same 19th century period that Paul's is. But the irony here, and this is the reason you should hear this, is that when we bought it 40 some odd years ago, we were in a neighborhood that was urban renewal. And the large neighborhood houses that are now preserved in a historic district were in fact potentially demolition targets. And furthermore, just before we arrived, I don't think there were many left when we came, these big houses were being occupied by communes. Just think, that's what it was like in those days. So it's really important to have that, I guess I'm going to call it frame of reference, to understand how things can change and how what at that point in time, at least, had been deemed not worth preserving has become significant, a neighborhood of a strong neighborhood, by the way, but also a neighborhood that is a now local historic district. So things change, and it's always hopeful to think about we can make changes. I guess that's my final thought on this. Anyway, thank you very much for your thoughts and comments. And for everybody's information, this is being recorded and will become available on YouTube and through our local broadcast folks, BIG. And we hope will be shared with the larger community. So thank you all and hope to see you soon.